An all-out anti-corruption campaign is sweeping China, snaring some former top leaders. This comes as a result of President Xi Jinping setting rule of law as one of his key reforms for China. What's the difference between rule of man, or rule of power, and rule of law? How does rule of law work in China today? And how does President Xi seek to improve it? Furthermore, what's the difference between rule of law in China and in the Western world? What's the relationship between the power of the party and the rule of law? Rule of law gets us closer to China. How do you define rule of law? How is it applied in China today, and what have been some of the problems in recent years?
The concept of rule of law was first brought up by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. For thousands of years, people have had a diverse understanding and definition of this idea. In China, it was at the fourth plenary session of the 18th Central Committee of the CPC that the decision to comprehensively advance the law-based governance of China was adopted. I think the connotations of rule of law lie in the following aspects. First, we need to have good laws, which should be a manifestation of social justice, the rules of social development, and of people's will. Second, in the whole course of administrating the country, the law is the very basic foundation. Other social rules, like ethical and social standards, are all subject to it. Third, after the legislation, all people and organizations must obey and implement the law equally. No one is privileged to be beyond the law.
President Xi Jinping has made rule of law the core of his domestic reform agenda. How do you define rule of law in general, and then how do you define socialist rule of law for its applicability in China, and are there Chinese characteristics to rule of law?
我们提出依法治国，首先是我们认识到社会发展的规律的要求。
We emphasize rule of law because we have realized it's necessary at this stage of our social development.
那市场经济本身就是法治经济，因为它把人解放出来。
The market economy is a legalized economy. People are free to pursue their own interests, but how can we balance their demands?
怎么来共同决定一些事情？那在这种情况下，应该说只有一条，就是建立法治。
Under this circumstance, establishing rule of law is the only method to deal with it. The rule of law is an inevitable result as we push forward reforms and promote the socialist market economy. The conditions are different in different countries. There are some similarities between China and the West as we both uphold the supremacy of the law.
Rule of law, which is one of President Xi Jinping's core policies for reform. From your perspective as a think tank executive and as a journalist, a leading journalist, how do you look at this issue in terms of the importance for China?
Last year, our CPC Congress talking about the rule of law. After that, so many public opinion, they shouted, they love it. Why? Because they think, does it mean that in the past 65 years there are no any rule of law? It's a joke, you know. So nowadays we are talking about rule of law. That is, first, the law decides the political procedure. That's the first. The second is the law decides the power of party. The third is the law decides the power of the bureau chief. And also, final is the law decides the social procedure.
How do you define rule of law, and why is it so important in China today?
It's not easy, but you know, rule of law today is so important. It's not just important in China. I think it's all over the world. It seems to me the rule of law is the most important part of the human being. the culture today, the modern society. So for China, it's a long history, 1,000 years, but today, to the direction of modern rule of law, we take a lot of challenge, but it's very important for the market here and for the people and for the future, I think. Yeah.
Trace the history of rule of law from the beginning of the People's Republic of China. What has been the experience that China has gone through during some tumultuous periods, and what can we learn from this historical experience?
中国49年成立中华人民共和国之后，在法治建设的
The People's Republic of China was established in Beijing on October 1st, 1949. To develop rule of law in China, we have been through a lot of difficulties. In the early period since its foundation, we had the common program of the CPPCC and the 1954 Constitution. At that time, China began to establish its own legal system and incorporate new characteristics. In the mid-1950s, people came to ignore the legal system, which led to the Cultural Revolution and made China stop developing for 10 years. Over that period, we didn't have criminal law and civil law. It was not until 1978 that China advocated to strengthen the rule of law in the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee of the CPC. In the meantime, we brought up the 16-character principle. There must be laws to go by. The laws must be observed and strictly enforced, and lawbreakers must be prosecuted. Since then, rule of law in China had made great progress and reached major achievements. Then, in the 1990s, as China implemented economic reforms towards a socialist market economy, we put forward the idea of respecting and guaranteeing human rights into the Constitution, as well as making China a socialist country under the rule of law. During the fourth plenary session of the 18th Central Committee of the CPC, we decided to advance the rule of law in China comprehensively. In a word, rule of law in China has made great progress over time. During this process, the Chinese Communist Party has learned from history and came to a conclusion that we need to run this country and build a socialist economy under the rule of law, instead of solely by policies, because only rule of law can guarantee us long-term stability and sustainable development, and only rule of law can ensure that people are the masters of the country. The reason why we made this decision on the fourth plenary session of the 18th Central Committee of the CPC is to ensure China to develop in a stable and sustainable environment. This is a crucial strategic move.
In China, you talk about a socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics. What is the difference between a socialist rule of law and just a rule of law?
If you want to know what the socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics is, the only thing I can tell you is that based on our national realities, we figured out the path of Chinese socialism and we took it. On one hand, socialist rule of law meets the requirement of the rule of law. That means it should promote social equity and justice, and the rule of law must be taken as the basic approach in governing the country. Second, it needs to match the Chinese political system, which is the socialist. Third, it needs to be cohesive with the traditional Chinese culture. As Montesquieu said in The Spirit of Laws, every factor of a country, like history and geography, decides its own law. With an abstract concept and exaggerated standard, not a single country can succeed in building its legal system.
Can we learn more about the rule of law by contrasting it with the so-called rule of man or rule of power?
Rule of man and rule of law are very popular debate topics in legal circles. People's opinions differ. Some believe rule of law still needs the help of man. But actually, rule of man has its own specific meaning. In Chinese or world history, rule of man means the highest ruler governed his country, while he himself was not restrained by law. This may lead to extremes because he could become self-indulgent if he has unrestrained power. The rule of law differs from rule of man in that the power of the highest governor is restricted by law. To me, this is the major difference.
Culture Express. See the world in color.
Some would say that the corruption cases are certainly accurate and legitimate, but they only scratch the surface, that in reality corruption is very systemic at different levels and everybody does it in one way or another. And so it's not just a few bad apples, as we say in English, but it's really a systemic problem. And so how do you change a whole society from the systemic approach to kinds of corruption to a true rule of law?
西方这个评论呢，说是一个表面的，我不太赞成。
I don't agree with Western countries' comments that our anti-corruption campaign seems more like tokenism. Rather, it's quite substantive. And we cannot call the corruption problem in China a systematic one either. There are special reasons behind this problem. First, China is at a transitional stage right now, meaning that we cannot use the old system anymore, but the new one has yet to be built. So our core challenge is to minimize corruption by advancing the rule of law. This is our next goal. In America, even with separation of powers, there was once rampant corruption, and now it has been gradually solved. So this takes time. If you come to this conclusion on superficial facts, only that China suffers systematic corruption and our system is not good enough, I cannot accept this view. Indeed, our system is flawed, but that just means our governance needs further improvement, and we're rightly heading towards that direction.
Some foreign critics would assert that the anti-corruption campaign is more about factions in the party, political struggles, power consolidation.
当然，我的回答肯定是不合理的。我们之所以反对腐败
Of course, my answer is that it's not accurate. I just mentioned that the main reason why we're fighting against corruption is that it's weakening the party and the government's authority and causing a loss of public support.
腐败在使这个执政党丧失民心。
So anti-corruption is not about political struggles, but about the restoration of the Communist Party and the government's authority,
而是要
which is of great importance to national development.
恢复政府的公权力的权威， 这个对一个国家的发展它是至关重要的。
One example that serves as a lesson of China's rule of law are the cases of Hu Jil-tu and Zhao Zhihong. In 2005, Zhao was sentenced to death for 21 counts of murder, rape, and robbery. Among his convictions was for a crime that took place in Inner Mongolia in 1996, for which the 18-year-old Hu Jil-tu was wrongfully executed. Zhao confessed to the murder. For years, Hu Jil-tu's family appealed for a retrial. Nearly 2 decades after his execution, on December 15, 2014, his conviction was overturned by a high court in Inner Mongolia.
We sincerely apologize to you.
In January 2015, his family received about $330,000 in state compensation. Hu Jil-tu's highly publicized case shows the Chinese government's efforts and determination to ensure justice for all under the rule of law. At this year's meeting of the National People's Congress, the Supreme People's Court and Supreme People's Procuratorate issued their work reports. They pledged to deliver a sense of fairness and justice for people in all judicial cases. The president of China's Supreme People's Court, Zhou Qiang, says over the past year, more than 1,300 wrongful and erroneous criminal cases have been overturned, and that he feels deep remorse over these cases. He says he will increase openness in the system by enhancing public scrutiny and vows to make major reforms.
Judicial reforms have entered deep water. We must be courageous in breaking down the barriers of vested interest, including those within our system. We are ready to crack a hard nut and make sacrifices if necessary.
It would seem that the decisions of the fourth plenary of the 18th Party Central Committee, which changed the reporting structure of the local judiciary, the court system, from the local level to the provincial level, is a very substantial change in creating an effective independence from the interest holders at the local level. This has not been given very much credit in the West, that still sees the whole system as not independent. But this change of how the judicial system reports, how important is that in China?
You're really keeping up with what's going on in China. After all, you have studied China for years. This change you talked about is a major one. As an important component of judicial reform under the framework of the Constitution, we're now pushing forward to develop the mechanism that judges of local courts under the provincial level are nominated, appointed, and dismissed according to the statutory procedures by provincial authorities in a unified way. The greatest benefit of this change is that it ensures the court's independence from local governments and thus judicial integrity. So it's a very significant change.
Is legal process itself on the case level undergoing significant reform in China?
The fourth plenary session brought up the exclusionary rule on lawfully obtained evidence, which is that evidence obtained against legal procedures or through illegal means shall not be admitted. This is a very important part of judicial reform. Your observation is right.
Are there interest groups in the party or in society that are resisting the implementation of rule of law more seriously in China?
那自然是有的。依法治国很重要的2个方面，一个是社会的管理。
Yes, of course. The rule of law has 2 important aspects. One is social governance and the other is the restraint of power, putting power in the cage of the legal system. In other words, is to keep the powers in check. because in the past we lacked restraint on power and some people gained a lot of interest from this loophole. But now we want to curb the powers, which means the interests of vested groups will be violated and they will undoubtedly rise up to resist.
Are there groups in China, interest groups, that are opposing the increasing importance of rule of law?
Yeah, of course, I admit. That's a very complicated issue. That's a very sensitive issue, and that's still a big challenge of the country's future. For my opinion, that is, it's not bad thing. It's not bad thing for interest group. But you have to encourage every interest group makes a voice, and let that voice debating.
Yeah.
And make every interest group debate each other.
Openly.
Openly. Yeah, that for the government. They don't scare about interest group. They should produce more and more platform, including the Lianghui 2 sessions, including the social media or other public media or official media, including those even the conference, a lot of public conference, or even case. They should produce more and more platforms to let interest group representatives voicing.
Trace to me the history of the legal practice in China, and where is it today?
You know, that is a big change the last 30 years. From very beginning time when we rebuilt the legal profession at the later of 1970s. So only 100 or 200 number, but today it's more than 300,000.
Wow.
So it's a big change today. And also from the very traditional fields like criminal or family civil matters, but today the Chinese legal professional, lawyers, law firm, they take a full service in all fields. Any corner, need a law service, cause the law is governed any corner of the society already. So the modern legal services, including tax, commercial, M&A, even trade law and many fields, and also Chinese law firm lawyers cooperate very closely with the Western firms, Western lawyers. And the Chinese lawyers, they together with Chinese investors, their clients going global, and also help foreign investors or foreign clients doing shit in China. That's totally, it's a big change.
What type of reforms are there in the legislative process at the level of local government?
Development of China's legislative system witnessed a shift from being highly centralized to a trend of decentralization. According to the 1954 Constitution, legislative power belonged to the NPC. It was in 1982 that China expanded the legislative power locally. This means that the power was extended to the standing committees of provincial-level people's congresses and those comparatively larger cities. The fourth plenum session specified that cities subdivided into districts have the legislative power, and will also make relevant changes to the legislation law. From my understanding, this is to expand local autonomy. For a country as big as China, it is difficult for the central government to decide on all of this. The laws that are well applied in Shanghai may not necessarily work in Qinghai, so there is the need to expand autonomy. It's an essential change in the relationship between the central system and the local, one that we will incentivize the local system and give rise to more dynamism. However, there are also people who worry about the abuse of power, so we must first specify the spectrum in which greater autonomy can be allowed, namely the affairs on which local authorities can enjoy legislative power. Second, a guarantee mechanism or the filing and review mechanism should be put in place to guarantee that local regulations are filed to the Standing Committee of the NPC for review, while local rules are filed to the State Council Legislative Affairs Office for review. Citizens can also write proposals to the reviewing body if they find that any regulation or rule contravenes the Constitution or a national law. After review, the filing body will be notified to modify or revoke the regulation or rule in question. So we can say the establishment of such a mechanism is a major reform for China at the moment.
President Xi's focus on rule of law is a milestone. Although systems of law have existed throughout China's long history of ruling systems, they were always subject to intervention by ruling elites. This enabled local officials to influence judicial decisions for their own immoral and nefarious purposes. Initiatives in the past have sought to strengthen China's laws, but this time, under President Xi, seems different. One need only watch the parade of disgraced officials being named, shamed, detained, and jailed. More systematically, judicial reform has set the supremacy of the law over administrative organs. Local courts will now be administered at the provincial level, which will prevent city and county officials from interfering in legal proceedings. Here's a puzzle. To strengthen rule of law is said not to weaken the rule of the party. How can this be? First, many officials simply ignored the law as if one of the privileges of their positions. Some took bribes to deliberately subvert law enforcement and judicial processes for personal gain. Some were just ignorant. However, President Xi has now made it clear that all party officials must abide by the law. The judiciary in China is not so much completely independent as in the Western separation of powers model. Rather, President Xi talks about putting power in a cage, which means confining and limiting officials' power. We follow the rule of law to keep closer to China.